And
great, thank you, Laura.
Sure.
So welcome, everybody. My name is Jen Epstein, and I'm here with my colleague and friend, Bethany Bagent, and we are excited to join you tonight. And share a little presentation. It's easy for me to say because Bethany's going to do most. We're going to do a little presentation of the dedication. Dedication took place 19, so it's 100 years ago this year, and we've spent a lot of time doing some work on this, and Bethany in particular done a lot of research on this. So I will turn it over to her. Yes, please put in the chat like where you're from and any other interesting, if you feel like sharing anything. And if you have any questions along the way, we'll keep an eye on that, and we're happy to answer anything as it comes up. So I will pass it on to Bethany. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, so the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial became a little bit of a sort of obsession of mine, particularly as the memorial turned 100 this year. It was something that I began to research heavily, and I think that it's a very interesting story that perhaps isn't a well-known part of the Lincoln Memorial legacy. And hopefully we can certainly make it that way, particularly this year. But the dedication ceremony itself took place at 2:30 p.m. on Tuesday, May 30th, 1922. Now that particular day was chosen because it was a national holiday, and that would mean that most high-ranking government officials would be free to attend. This was considered to be the signature event of the year. It was very much an anticipated event, particularly to dedicate this national tribute to Abraham Lincoln. And that particular time was chosen so that the dedication did not interfere with the Decoration Day ceremonies that were taking place at Arlington Cemetery earlier that day. Now, this was a well-attended event. It's estimated that up to about 50,000 people came to the dedication ceremony. This included approximately 3,500 invited guests, as well as the general public. And to try and reach sort of the widest audience possible, the dedication ceremony was also broadcasted simultaneously on 2 separate frequencies, something that had never been done before. And it's estimated that nearly 1 million people tuned in to listen to the festivities of this hour-long dedication. Now, among many of the invited guests was, of course, the guest of honor. This was perhaps the most celebrated guest who attended the dedication. This is Abraham Lincoln's only surviving son, Robert Lincoln, who was about 78 years old at the time. And this would be his last major public event. And what's really interesting about this story is that when he accepts the invitation to attend the ceremony, he says, "We of course shall attend, but only on par with the general public. We prefer that no notice whatever be taken of us." Now, of course, that was never going to happen. Robert Todd Lincoln does not speak at the dedication, but when he does arrive, he does receive the loudest and longest applause of anyone who participates in the ceremony itself. And there's probably 2 reasons why Robert Lincoln does not want to be an active participant in the ceremony. The first, he really wasn't comfortable inserting himself into his father's legacy. He was very interested in this national tribute, almost from the very beginning. And he and William Howard Taft, who was not only president of the United States at the time, but also will be president of the Lincoln Memorial Commission, the 2 are friends. And Robert Lincoln would often write Taft just to see how things were going, even when the legislation was being debated. Robert sometimes pitched in money to pay for things. We know that he would often drive by the construction site. He was living in Washington, D.C. at the time, just to see how work was progressing. We do have one recorded visit in which he showed friends the site even before it was open to the public. But when he was often asked to publicly speak about his father, he tended to do so as a son speaking about a father, not as about a historian or a scholar speaking about a president. And he was often very hesitant to really sort of talk about his father in a political sense. So perhaps that's one reason that he chose not to speak at the ceremony. Maybe another, though, was, and you kind of see in this picture here, he wasn't in the best of health at the time. And you can kind of see him being escorted, assisted up those stairs. He did suffer from what we today would call irritable bowel syndrome. And whenever he was nervous or excited, sometimes his symptoms would spike. And in fact, about a week or so before the ceremony, he would write Taft and he would ask permission for his personal physician to not only attend the ceremony, but to sit near him if he would need him. So perhaps these are two reasons why Robert Lincoln decided not to actively participate. But of course, once the ceremony was over, he was the person that everyone sort of swarmed and would ask a million questions. Another sort of interesting individual who attended the ceremony is someone you may have heard of, Joe Cannon, the gentleman that is right here. He was one time a very powerful Speaker of the House. And what's interesting about Joe Cannon is that he actually held up legislation to build the Lincoln Memorial for a very long time. And it wasn't because he didn't revere Lincoln, and it wasn't because he didn't feel that Lincoln deserved a memorial. It had to do with location. And the location that was chosen, and you can kind of see where he's coming from when you sort of take a look at this picture. The location that was chosen for the memorial was or is reclaimed land. And at one point, it was actually referred to as the Potomac Mudflats. This is where Washingtonians brought their trash. But after it had been reclaimed, it was really a blank canvas, and really anything could be built out there. And so the Lincoln Memorial really wasn't restricted in size and scope because this location was chosen. But Joe Cannon actually once said, "So long as I live, I'll never let them build a memorial to Abraham Lincoln in that gosh darn swamp. The building would shake itself down with loneliness and algae." And so you can see in the image here, you kind of understand where he's coming from. Although once the memorial and the surrounding area is finished, he would say that he was glad he had been proven wrong. Joe Cannon did, again, greatly admire Lincoln and even claimed to have met Lincoln once when he was a child. So he was another interesting individual who attended. And then, of course, perhaps the other group that garnered the most attention were Civil War veterans themselves, both from the Union as well as the Confederates. They were given a very prominent place to sit at the dedication. If we take a look at this picture really quick, you can see where the red square, they're sitting just below the large staircase, sort of right up here in front. And if you take a kind of close look at this picture, you'll see that it's very much a sort of an integrated group. You have both Union veterans there, as well as members of the USCT, as well as Confederate veterans sitting together. And at one point, there were some who suggested that perhaps they take an active role in the dedication. There were some who thought that perhaps they should line up on either side, slowly make their way up the steps to the first platform, silently shake hands as though they're coming together in a reunion, and then return to their seats. That portion of the ceremony, though, would ultimately be cut for time. And so they did not necessarily have an active role in the ceremony. We don't necessarily know how many Civil War veterans actually attended. Most of the newspapers at the time either referred to as a handful or a smattering. And I don't quite know how you quantify a smattering, but by looking at the picture, perhaps 30 to 40 veterans were at the ceremony in 1922. Now, once the ceremony began, the invocation was said by Dr. Wallace Radcliffe, who was the current pastor of the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. This was the church that the Lincolns attended while they were in Washington. Lincoln in particular liked this church because the pastor at the time, Phineas Gurley, focused more on scripture than he did on politics. And Lincoln felt that he got enough politics during the week, and he didn't necessarily want to hear that on Sunday. Now, after the invocation was the presentation of colors by the Grand Army of the Republic. The GAR was a fraternal organization that was founded shortly after the Civil War. and it was open to anyone who fought honorably for the Union. And by 1890, membership had really sort of peaked. It had nearly 500,000 members and 7,000 posts. And almost every prominent veteran was enrolled, including 5 presidents: Grant, Hayes, Garfield, Harrison, and McKinley. And perhaps today, the GAR's most lasting legacy to the nation is the annual observance of Memorial Day or Decoration Day on May 30th. Now, the GAR also wanted a more active role in addition to presenting the colors at the time. And one of the reasons I mentioned this is that they wanted past presidents of the GAR to represent certain factions within the Union Army. That included the rank and file, those who fought in the West, those who came from border states, as well as sailors. And the gentleman that was chosen to represent the rank and file was a man by the name of James Tanner, who does play kind of a prominent role to some degree in Lincoln's legacy. He was a Civil War veteran, and as a young man, he fought in the Second Battle of Bull Run in Manassas, Virginia. And in that battle, he would be gravely injured. In fact, he would lose both of his legs below the knee. Now, while he's recovering, he's going to learn to write shorthand, and he will move to Washington, D.C. to work for the War Department. And he just happened to be renting a room across the street from Ford's Theater on April 14th, 1865, when the president is assassinated. And after he's brought across the street to the Peterson House, where he will be placed in the back bedroom, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton would use the parlor of the Peterson home to really begin the manhunt for the assassins and the conspirators. And this is where he began to interview many of those who were in the theater that night. And so much information began to come in that he realized he needed someone to write shorthand. And so he puts a call out, and James Tanner, who is residing right next door, is available. So Tanner does come over and he does record the notes of that night. And there's some of the best records we have about what happened in the theater on the night of the assassination. Now, James Tanner does not get to take part in the ceremony. This is also cut for time. For some reason, the Lincoln Memorial Commission very much wanted to keep this ceremony within an hour. So much of the things that were suggested never actually took place, but I kind of think it's interesting that James Tanner, who played such a large role in recording a lot of what happened the night of the assassination, could have taken part in the dedication ceremony. Now, after the presentation of colors is the keynote address. This will be delivered by Dr. Robert Russo Moten, who was probably the most prominent Black educator at the time. He was born in Amelia County, Virginia, which is about 50 miles south of Richmond. And he grew up on a farm that was close to the plantation where both of his parents had been enslaved prior to his birth. Now, both of his parents, recognizing that their son would have far more opportunities than they had, very much instilled in him the value of a good education. So after saving enough money, Dr. Moten would enroll in what today is known as Hampton University here in Virginia. And upon graduation, he will be offered a position there, which today would sort of be the equivalent of Dean of Students. And he will actually hold that position for nearly 25 years, up until about 1915. And there, at that date, he will be offered an opportunity to become the second president of Tuskegee Institute upon the death of his good friend and mentor, Booker T. Washington. And this will be a position that he will accept. And in his 20 years at the school, Dr. Moten really begins to make a name for himself. Not only does he emphasize vocational education, but he also starts to integrate liberal arts into the curriculum and establishes a Bachelor of Science degree in agriculture and education at the Institute. He also becomes an advisor to 5 US presidents: Wilson, Harding, Coolidge, Hoover, and Roosevelt. And during the First World War, he will travel overseas to France on behalf of President Wilson, to really record information on how Black soldiers are being treated during the war. And so he is a very, very well-known figure at the time. But one of the reasons that there's Tuskegee, one of the reasons that he is chosen to speak at the dedication ceremony, though, is because he's considered by many to be a safe choice. He was thought of as an accommodationist, someone who placed economical gain above political and social equality. Now, this was really a mantle that he will inherit from Booker T. Washington. This was sort of the so-called Tuskegee idea, which preached the virtues of hard work, thrift, industrial education, and friendly cooperation. But for Dr. Moten, he believed that accommodation had its limits. And by 1922, he very much felt that there were too many segregationist laws, too much mob violence, and too many lynchings. And so what he hoped to do at the dedication is not only honor Abraham Lincoln, but to use this opportunity to plea for racial justice. And in his draft speech, he says, so long as any group within the nation is denied an equal opportunity for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the task is still unfinished. So long as any group is denied the fullest privilege of a citizen to share both the making and the execution of the law which shapes its destiny. So long as any group does not enjoy every right and every privilege that belongs to every American citizen without regard to race, creed, or color, the task for which the immortal Lincoln gave the last full measure of devotion, that task is still unfinished. What a nobler thing can the nation do than hear about this shrine to dedicate itself by its own determined will to fulfill to the last letter the lofty task imposed upon it by the sacred dead. More than 60 years ago, he said in prophetic warning, this nation cannot endure half slave and half free. It will become one thing or all the other. With equal truth, it can be said today, no more can the nation endure half privileged and half repressed, half educated and half uneducated, half protected and half unprotected, half prosperous and half in poverty, half in health and half in sickness, half content and half in discontent, yes, half free and half yet in bondage. My fellow citizens, in the great name which we honor here today, I say unto you that this memorial which we erect in token of our veneration is but a hollow mockery, a symbol of hypocrisy, unless we together can make it real in our national life, in every state and in every section, the things for which he died. This is a fair and goodly land. Much right have we, both Black and white, to be proud of our achievements at home and our increasing service around the world. Now, this is a very powerful speech, and I think we can imagine that had he had the opportunity to actually say these words on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, this certainly perhaps would match other very important speeches that were given in this same location. Unfortunately for Dr. Moten, when he accepts the invitation to speak, there was a clause in the invitation which required him to turn over his speech for consideration prior to the ceremony. And one of the reasons the commission wanted to see it, as they say in this letter, is to make sure that it's the right length. Now, I think Dr. Moten knew in his heart that he would not be allowed to deliver those words. And so I don't think he was necessarily shocked when a few days later he receives this telegram from Taft, which says, shall have to ask you to cut 500 words and suggest that in making the cut, you give more unity and symmetry by emphasizing tribute and lessening appeal. I am sure you wish to avoid any insinuation of attempt to make the occasion one for propaganda. Our personal relations make me feel that you will understand my motive in the suggestion. Now, very shortly after he receives this telegram, Dr. Moten has already written back that he has already begun to change and to revise his speech. And so I think he realized that this was not going to pass through the commission and that he would have to alter his speech in some way. And unfortunately, he does really replace the tone of protest with what many refer to sort of as grateful language. Gone is the reproach of the national government, and he certainly removes all reference to national hypocrisy. And really, instead of stressing grievances, he tends more to focus on the achievements of Black Americans at the time. Although in his conclusion, I think he says something very, very important, and it's something that Rangers at the Lincoln Memorial certainly point out as being part of the Lincoln Memorial legacy, this idea of unfinished work. He concludes his speech that he does give by saying, I somehow believe that all of us, Black and white, both North and South, are going to strive on to finish the work which he so nobly began to make America an example for the world of equal justice and equal opportunity for all who strive and all willing to serve under the flag that makes men free. So I think that that certainly that aspect at least does become a very important part of the legacy. I think though what makes the censorship of Dr. Moten so profound and perhaps even ironic is that the very thing that he was speaking out against had actually taken place at that very dedication ceremony. Whitfield McKinley was a businessman, a real estate agent, and he was the first Black customs collector at the Port of Georgetown, a position that he'd been appointed to by President William Howard Taft. And so when he and his wife received an invitation to attend the Lincoln Memorial dedication, they are not only honored, very, very excited. And they actually arrived to the ceremony early, bearing green tickets which say platform section 5. And they actually believe, because they received this invitation, that those seats would be somewhere up towards the front, particularly in view of the speaker platform where William Howard Taft would be sitting. And so I think you can sort of understand their surprise when the Marine escort begins to lead them away from the front towards the back of the ceremony in a roped off section with hard backless benches in the weeds and overgrown grass. Now, when they reach that section, Mr. McKinley is a little bit shocked. So they feel that perhaps they would be sitting somewhere up here, and instead they find themselves down here in this red section. And just to kind of put it into perspective for you, this is where they would be sitting in relation to the speaker platform, which is up here. And if you remember, this is where the veterans themselves were sitting. So they are about what Mr. McKinley would consider to be about a block away. And when they reach this section, he pauses because I think that it's slowly starting to dawn on him what is happening. Now, Washington, D.C. at that time was a segregated city. It had become increasingly more so under the administration of Woodrow Wilson. But for an occasion such as this, particularly one that's outdoors, and particularly one that's to a dedication for memorial to Abraham Lincoln, this was a bit of a surprise. And so when he gets there, he pauses. And he pauses so long that his escort tells him to sit down, in which Mr. McKinley responds by saying, you know what, I'll think about it. To which the Marine responds, well, you better think damn quick. Now, when he says this, the other guests sitting in that section become visibly upset, particularly because of these words being said in front of their wives. And a supervisor comes over to see what's happening. And after hearing what had taken place, the supervisor immediately takes the position of the Marine, and even takes it a step further by saying that's the only way that you can deal with these people. Now, after saying that, this nearly causes a riot. And once cooler heads eventually prevail, the McKinleys and 28 other guests decide, instead of staying here and being treated in this disgraceful, really disgusting manner, they instead choose to simply leave. What should have been a joyous occasion, something that they were very much looking forward to turned into a very terrible situation. And afterwards, after the ceremony, one of the guests that decided to leave a man by the name of George Murray, who was a lawyer, decided to write Taft, not as President of the United States, not as Chief Justice, but as Chairman and President of the Lincoln Memorial Commission. And he writes and he says that I'm writing to invite your attention to an incident in connection with the dedication last Tuesday, which in the minds of those involved marred what should have been a proud and happy day. The particular incident to which I refer was the segregation of the colored guests in section V. This segregation is interpreted by the majority as an attempt to publicly humiliate them on the occasion of the dedication of a memorial to the great emancipator. And in justice to their self-respect, they were forced to leave. Among such persons were many who claimed to be your personal friends and others of whom I was one. Our resentment arises over the belief that such an assignment and segregation was a concession to the Southern social sentiment, which was entirely out of place on this public occasion. And perhaps to Taft's credit, he actually writes Murray back, which you can see here in this telegram. But what he writes is certainly kind of shocking. He says, "My dear sir, I am surprised at your letter of June 1st. I directed Colonel Sherrill that no such segregation should be made as to which you would refer. If colored people did sit in a particular place, it must have been accidental, for certainly nobody having authority connected with the dedication was authorized to bring it about. Sincerely yours, William Howard Taft." Now, the Colonel Sherrill that he's speaking about had really already run afoul of Black Washingtonians at the time. He was the superintendent of public buildings and grounds, and this was a position that really put him in charge of all public spaces in Washington, D.C., including the city's 483 public parks. And one of the things that he had already tried to do was to segregate the picnic spaces in nearby Rock Creek Park. And in this particular situation, the local chapters of the NAACP were actually able to stop this. But he already had a bad reputation, and he would make things even worse when he is quoted in a newspaper in saying that, "I regret very much to hear that the seating of a number of colored people next to each other has aroused the resentment mentioned in your letter. People were by no means restricted to the section by which you refer, and I can see no reason why any colored person assigned a seat in this section should object so strenuously in sitting next to other colored people. Objection might just as readily have been made by newspaper people that were all seated together in a similar section, or by members of Congress that were seated in a section exclusively for them." One newspaper, after reading this, one newspaper editor responded and wondered, in offering such a line or reasoning, Colonel Sherrill shows himself either stupid or insincere. We are inclined to think that it's due to insincerity because the argument which he uses is the old stark argument intended to confuse people when they protest against segregation. Certainly they do not object to sitting next to one another, but they do and have a right to object to being herded off to one side as though they were pariah. What they resented was the compulsory segregation, which could not carry with it anything less than a badge of imputed inferiority. And after this is all published, again, local chapters of the NAACP will ask President Harding, to dismiss Sherrill from his position. Unfortunately, they do not win that argument, and he is allowed to simply keep his position, and nothing ultimately comes of the segregation that happened at the Lincoln Memorial dedication. But there is very much an important legacy piece, which we'll get to in just a minute here. But if we do sort of go back to the dedication ceremony, there were other speakers of the day. One of them was a 70-year-old poet by the name of Edwin Markham, who was from Oregon, who was really sort of a popular literary figure during the first half of the 20th century. And most of his works celebrated peace, love, as well as reform. And perhaps his most famous poem is based off a painting by Jean-Francois Millet, which is called "The Man with the Hoe." And Markham's poem, based on this painting, really sort of becomes or embodies the suffering of oppressed labor throughout world history at the time. This launches Markham's career as a poet and really sort of transforms him into kind of a minor celebrity at the time. And so this is one of the reasons that he's invited to read a poem at the Lincoln Memorial dedication. The one he reads is called Lincoln, the Man of the People. It was a poem that he had written in 1900 to celebrate the 91st birthday of Abraham Lincoln, although at the time he called it Lincoln, the Great Commoner. Now, after the poem, the next person to speak is Chief Justice William Howard Taft. His job that day really is to present the memorial to President Harding, who will accept it on behalf of the American people. And really what Taft wants to do at the dedication ceremony was greatly different than what Dr. Moten had wanted to do. For Taft, the dedication really was an opportunity to further show secular healing. And in his speech, one of the things that he says is that here on the banks of the Potomac, the boundary between the two sections whose conflict made the burden, passion, and triumph of his life is appropriate that it should stand. Visible in its distant beauty from the Capitol, whose great dome symbolizes the Union, which he saved. Seen in all its grandeur from Arlington, where lie the nation's honored dead who fell in the conflict, Union and Confederate alike, it marks the restoration of the brotherly love of the two sections in this memorial, of one who is as dear to the hearts of the South as to those of the North. Here is a shrine at which we can all worship. Now, President Harding, who speaks after him, after he accepts the memorial, will take this certainly one step further. And President Harding will say, the supreme chapter in history is not emancipation, though that achievement would have exalted Lincoln throughout the ages. The simple truth is that Lincoln, recognizing an established order, would have compromised with the slavery that existed if he could have halted its extension. Hating human slavery as he did, he doubtless believed in its ultimate abolition through the developing consciousness of the American people, but he would have been the last man in the Republic to resort to arms to effect its abolition. Emancipation was a means to a great end, maintained union and nationality. Here was the great purpose, here the towering hope, here the supreme faith, the Union must be preserved. He also goes on to say that he knew he had freed a race of bondsmen, and he had given to the world the costly proof of the perpetuity of the American Union. But I cannot restrain the wish that he might somehow know of the monuments to his memory throughout the world, and that we are dedicating today on behalf of a grateful nation, this matchless memorial, whose 48 columns, representing 48 states in the concord of the Union, testified that the end brought him out all right. Now, one of the reasons I mentioned that part of the speech is that he got a little bit of the memorial history wrong. There are, in fact, 36 columns that represent the 36 states that were part of the Union at the end of the Civil War. The 48 states are engraved, but they're engraved above on the upper frieze as opposed to the lower frieze. So a little bit of a mistake there in regards to the Lincoln Memorial. Now, one of the interesting things that happens when President Harding speaks is that there's a little bit of a ruckus that occurs. And I'm going to show you a little bit of a silent video. There is a 7-minute video of the dedication day, and I'm going to see if you can figure out exactly what happened as President Harding is speaking. It caused a little bit of panic in the crowd. You can kind of see it there. An airplane does begin to fly overhead, and it flies about 200 feet above the crowd, which was pretty close. And in fact, at one point, it actually drowns out what President Harding is trying to say. And this plane is being driven by a pilot who is a test pilot, as well as a second lieutenant in the Army Air Reserves. He was also at the time considered to be a bit of a hotshot. Now, airplanes at the time, there weren't many rules regarding when and where they could go. The airways were a little bit like the Wild West at the time. There weren't rules and regulations that we have today. But in an attempt to keep this thing from happening, Colonel Sherrill will put out on behalf of the commission, he will issue a no-fly zone within 2 miles of the Lincoln Memorial between the hours of 2 and 5 to keep this sort of thing from happening. This did happen to Harding once before, and an acceptance speech in Virginia, a plane did fly overhead, again, disrupting the ceremony a little bit. So they wanted to keep this from happening. Fahey, the pilot who is flying the plane, actually says that he got the times wrong. He thought that he could fly just a little bit after 2. And he actually took a newspaper reporter and photographer up with him. So he does get into a little bit of trouble. He is dismissed from the Reserve Corps, and he is charged with disrespecting the president and endangering the safety of the audience assembled. And I think one of the interesting things that comes out of this is that shortly after the dedication, members of Congress do issue bills. They don't pass necessarily at that time, but they introduce bills that carry a pretty severe penalty for airplane stunts over crowds of more than 100 people. It's $1,000 and a year in jail. So kind of think of that being 1923, $1,000 is pretty good money at the time. And what makes this more kind of an interesting story is that several weeks later, Fahey flying that same plane crashes and actually kills his co-pilot. So you can imagine what would have happened had that actually happened there at the dedication ceremony itself. But thankfully, he's able to fly off safely. And the Lincoln Memorial dedication will eventually come to a close. Now, one last thing to sort of note about the dedication itself is how it is sort of reported or portrayed in the newspapers. If you take a look at the headlines of these two sort of very prominent, well-known newspapers at the time, you can see that they certainly sort of highlight what both Taft and Harding were trying to convey in their dedication speeches. Rank or dies, as sections unite in the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial. Veterans attend, references to the blue and the gray bring rounds of cheering. The country unites to consecrate Lincoln Shrine. So again, in the minds of many, this Lincoln Memorial was about reunification between the North and the South. That was its purpose, and certainly that was being conveyed at the ceremony. But if we look at how the dedication ceremony was presented by many of the Black newspapers at the time, it's much different. Jim Crow at Lincoln Memorial, at Memorial to Lincoln, segregation at the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial. And I think there's one newspaper that really sums up what exactly happened at the dedication itself. It is an article that was written at the time by the editor of the Chicago Defender, who will actually suggest that because of those dedication speeches and because of the segregation, that the memorial itself was opened, but it had not yet been dedicated. And so in this article, the editor will say, the day that should have been one of glory died one of shame. Sons of those who fought to destroy this nation stood in the shadow of the temple, abusing the hours of children whose fathers strangled treason at Petersburg and at Richmond. A former president threw around Lincoln a mantle of apology. The president denied the title that gives Lincoln deathless fame, that of emancipator. While a son of the race, Lincoln freed, found eager and faithful words falling on ears closed and deaf to reason. The Lincoln Memorial opened at the word of authority, but it remains undedicated. Let no devoted hand be laid upon its column. No feet tread the spot, eager to honor a name dishonored by that scene. Let no grateful eye yet see the proclamation chiseled on the Georgia stone. Pass the shrine by until a later date. Enter not, nor yearn to view it now. When juster and more grateful men come to power, and history shall have rebuked offenders against the name of Abraham Lincoln, those set free in his death, and glory will gather with their children and their benefactors to dedicate the memorial. No hand of treason shall touch the sacred law. No son of darkness shall deal curses upon the freed and the faithful. No half-cleaving tongue shall speak away the matchless tribute of Abraham Lincoln. With song, prayer, bold and truthful speech, with faith in God and country, later on, let us dedicate the temple thus far only opened. And I think if we sort of look at the history of the Lincoln Memorial, I think what the Chicago Defender has offering there certainly has been done time and time again. The Lincoln Memorial today not only speaks to this idea of reunification, but it also has very much become a forum where people from all over the world have come to finish the unfinished work, perhaps started by Abraham Lincoln. And they've done it with song, with prayer, with bold and truthful speech, time and time again. And I think two, perhaps, of the most well-recognized events to ever take place is the 1939 Marian Anderson concert, and of course, the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where Dr. King gave his very beautiful "I Have a Dream" speech. And I really want to close with something that Harding does say in his dedication speech, which I also think has become very true and a very important part of the Lincoln Memorial legacy. One of the things that he does say is this memorial, matchless tribute that it is less for Abraham Lincoln than for those of us today and those who will follow after. It is one of the most visited spaces in Washington, D.C. Year after year after year. Millions of people come to not only pay their respects to President Lincoln, but also stand on the spot where Marian Anderson sung, where Dr. King spoke, and where a million more have really shared their dreams and sort of helped build and establish the legacy and the Lincoln Memorial that we have today. So thank you, everyone. If anyone has any questions, I will be more than happy to answer those. And Jen, if you would like to add anything, please do.
I learned something new every time I listen to you, so thank you. And I love the picture of Moten. I thought that was really neat. I hadn't seen that one before, but you and I can talk anytime. So does anybody have any questions or anything for Bethany? I don't know if we even said it, but we both we work at the National Mall in Washington, D.C., and we are the education team at the mall, and we are available to go out into schools in our area and do virtual programs for those that are further away. So if there's ever anything we can do for you related to any of our subjects on the National Mall, we're happy to do so. So yeah, primary sources are very appreciated. And yeah, lots of nice comments in the chat.
Many of those primary sources are available at the Library of Congress. And Dr. Moten's, both the speech, his draft speech, as well as the speech that he delivers is available online. And I would encourage, if you have the chance, certainly look those up and read those, because I think those are speeches that don't get enough recognition. Oh, the picture of the memorial in the swamp. Yeah, it certainly wasn't what a location that many people, I think, would have thought of when they thought of Lincoln Memorial. But again, it was an opportunity to build whatever they wanted to. They weren't really constrained by anything. There were some thoughts of maybe putting the Lincoln Memorial up by the Capitol, kind of close to where Union Station is. And they thought that would make it easier for people to visit. But again, that would have had to have been a relatively small memorial if they had chosen that spot.
Questions. Some of the most often from questions.
I think one of the things that
here.
Well, I think one of the things that we kind of often say, especially with littler students, with littler kids, is a lot of times they ask us, where's his hat? You know, why isn't the president wearing his hat in the memorial? And of course, we often say, well, because he's sitting inside. But I think another thing that a lot of people ask, a lot of people want to know where the spot is that Dr. King spoke from. I think a lot of people come, they're looking for that particular spot.
Yeah, one of the things that we've really found interesting over the years, I think, is the kind of this transition from the idea that when they built it, it was really all about unity to what it is today. That, you know, I often say, well, it's not about, since we've both been working on the mall, which is now getting close to 25 years, we've seen every president use it, no matter which party. They all want to use the Lincoln Memorial. And so there is kind of this unifying theme to it. But really, if we ask kids, why should we have built a memorial to President Lincoln? It's very often about freedom and emancipation. And that's why we see people coming here. So this kind of over 100 years, how this message has sort of transformed itself has been really interesting to look at. And the stories from the dedication are just really, really fascinating stuff. Can I give my my stumped ranger question? When you asked about questions, I was standing on the steps at the spot where Dr. and I was stumped. I mean, not stumped. I just didn't, it took me a long time to answer. I had this little second grader standing on the steps with me, and he said, so if we had an Abraham Lincoln, why did we need a Dr. King? And to have a second grader stand there and recognize that was really something. I was pretty speechless, and that doesn't happen very often. Great. I grew up in Connecticut, and I was just there this weekend. So we'll look forward to seeing you in October. Yeah, I did a little research on that Nixon visit in the middle of the night. That was pretty fascinating too. There's so many great stories about the Lincoln Memorial. You worked the night shift for a while. Any celebrity visits?
Late night celebrity visits. I think the one that probably sticks out in my mind. And yeah, so we do have a shift that works, you know, close to midnight. And I worked on that shift for quite some time. And this was, again, late at night. There weren't that many people there. And one Mr. Sean Connery decided to make a visit to the Lincoln Memorial. He had just come from a ceremony at the Kennedy Center, which I think was really interesting because he began to ask all kinds of questions about the memorial. And my colleague, who was very much a James Bond fan, was sort of starstruck. And I'm not so much into movies and such, but it was kind of interesting, you know, to have somebody, I guess, that famous, you know, come into the memorial and to begin asking questions. I think Joe Louis was probably one of the sort of the coolest, perhaps, political figures. John Lewis, excuse me, John Lewis, that I have ever met at the Lincoln Memorial.
He was alive then.
Yes, no, John Lewis. That was an amazing visit as well.
I saw Schwarzenegger there once. I saw him photobomb somebody. It wasn't late at night, but people, I don't think he was as tall as I expected him to be, but he hopped in someone in the background of someone's picture. And that was really funny to see him walking down the steps. I didn't catch him until he was on his way down, but that was pretty funny. And I was also there the day they filmed the scene in National Treasure with Nicolas Cage and his friend sitting on the steps. And that was like an all-day film shoot for a scene that was, I think, 3 seconds long. So that was really fun to watch because they hired extras to be park rangers. And so there were these guys walking around who looked sort of like us, but their badges were like twice as big as ours, 3 times as big as ours. And all the visitors kept going to the fake park rangers to ask them questions. And they had to eventually come to us and ask us, where were the bathrooms? Because that was the question that everybody asked them. So that was really funny. I thought I could have been an extra. They got cut out of the movie anyway, but anyway. And I think they just filmed was the movie they just filmed? It was about Bayard Rustin, right? It's on the March on Washington. So I think they'll be you'll be seeing another movie from the mall soon, or maybe someday soon. One thing you'd like everyone to take away from their visit to the memorial.
Wow, that's a
hard one.
That's a good question. I personally think that one thing that makes memorials and monuments really interesting is that everybody has their own personal experience there. And everybody who comes to these memorials sees something different. Jen, you mentioned that you learn something different every time we talk about the Lincoln Memorial. But I think that, I think for us, one of the fascinating things is watching people experience, in particular, the Lincoln Memorial. And just to see what catches their attention right away. Is it the statue? Is it the spot where Dr. King spoke? Is it the view towards the Washington Monument? And I think it's really interesting just to, you don't have to view it one way. There's so much there. There's so much that happened there, that definitely, form your own experience there. And I think that's probably the most important thing that I would say about anyone who comes and visits the Lincoln Memorial.
Yeah, there were days when, we would stand there for a very long time. We used to have to spend hours just being there to answer questions or whatever. And it's not often that we get a chance to get into deep stories like this. I mean, this is a really, you don't have these kind of conversations standing at the memorial. It's a lot more of directions and, is he buried here? And how tall is that statue? And that kind of stuff. And I would find that it would be really kind of, oh, my feet are tired. I don't want to stand on this hard marble anymore. And I would stand near the steps, and you could watch people as they came up those steps, usually huffing and puffing a little. But besides that, once they got to the top, you would see their kind of eyes light up, and you could tell if they had never been here before, or if this was like something they hadn't seen in a long time, because the face would just show it all. And that's really kind of that amazing, wow, I've seen this in picture books and here I am now. And that's pretty, it's kind of an amazing thing to watch. And that would help get me through some cold winter days or hot summer days when you were just tired of being there. And I know that sounds awful to say, but when you're there for a long time and you don't really have some deep conversations, it was really fun to watch people's expressions and see how they saw the memorial. And yeah, as Bethany said, let them kind of figure it out for themselves and decide what sticks out to them.
I also think, one of the things that people do ask us a lot is, can you tell me 2 fascinating things about the memorial? Well, what I might find fascinating might be completely different than what you might find fascinating, and so quite often I would ask, well, what do you know about Abraham Lincoln? And whatever they would know, that's kind of what you could direct them to in the memorial, or maybe you would direct them to something they didn't know. Yeah, but that question of, what can you tell me, 2 things? Well, I can tell you about 100 fascinating things about the Lincoln Memorial. So I think that's kind of an interesting question that we get there a lot as well.
We often joke too that what we find interesting and what our students who come to visit find interesting may be completely different too. So we're always trying to get our students to tell us, hey, what do you, what interests you the most? And it's really interesting to try and get their perspective on that and try and help direct conversations that way. But oh, is the mall ever completed? That's a really was the mall completed by the time of the dedication? The mall's been changing for quite some time. That could be a whole talk unto itself, huh?
Yeah, and the reflecting pool wasn't completely finished at the time of the dedication. It was finished enough where they could put water in it, but a lot of landscaping work. And in fact, that picture that I showed you of Colonel Sherrill, who looked like he was trying to turn something on at the end of the reflecting pool where the World War II memorial now stands, that is what's called Rainbow Pool. And he was actually turning that on for the very first time. And so the Lincoln Memorial itself was finished enough to be dedicated. The building itself was done, but there was still a lot of landscaping work, a lot of approachways that weren't finished yet. There really, the extensions of the roads would even come much later than that. The ones that kind of go by the Lincoln Memorial that we know today. The Washington Monument grounds were finished, and then the National Mall, sort of the green space between that and the Capitol, were done. But the Lincoln Memorial was the second memorial built on the mall, the Washington Monument being first. And so again, there really wasn't that much after. It wouldn't be till 1943 that the Jefferson Memorial would be finished and added to sort of the collection of memorials that we have out there. And so, yeah, so as Jen said, the mall's evolved and it continues to evolve. I mean, 2 years ago, we dedicated the Eisenhower Memorial. We have a memorial who ground just broke, or I think they maybe dedicated the ground to honor the veterans of Desert Storm. So that will be sort of a small memorial that will sit kind of adjacent to where the Vietnam Veterans Memorial is located. I think I've heard many times that the mall is a completed work of art and that there isn't any additional space for any new memorials. A couple were grandfathered in, but it seems like we continue to add statues and plaques and update these memorials as time goes by. There was a new addition that was just dedicated at the Korean War Veterans Memorial. There's now a wall of names, which wasn't part of the original design, but it's something that people thought was definitely needed there at that memorial. So now we have that. Additions have been made to the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial, additions to the Lincoln Memorial where the engraving where Dr. King stood. So I think that is one of the fascinating things about being a ranger on the mall, is that most national parks tend to preserve what they have, where the mall itself continues to write new chapters within the story, and it continues to add monuments and memorials as time goes by and as we sort of change. And so I think that
unfinished work.
Said. And so I think that's a fascinating part of the mall itself. All of the changes that have been there since I started, we have 4 new memorials, 3, 4, something FDR, like that. I think
World War II is getting the FDR prayer plat. There's something being added at World War II now. The prayer that FDR gave around D-Day, is that what it is?
Yes.
So there's always something happening and new things happening and just the whole idea of protests and demonstrations. So those are always occurring. I mean, next year will be the 60th for the March on Washington. So there's always something happening and changing. Yeah.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Wow, this has been fascinating. Thank you both so much. I love the idea of the mall as just a constantly evolving kind of living memorial space.
Yeah, it really is.
I love it. Well, if there are no more questions, I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us tonight, and thank you to Bethany and Jennifer for being here. This was really fantastic. Thank you both so much.
Absolutely. Thank you everyone for joining.
Good night, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Good night.